Jacksonville, Florida. Looking at the other speakers and so forth, there seems to be a whole bunch of us that are centered around or have spent time with the University of Florida. That's where I got my master's degree in veterinary forensics. And being from Jacksonville and also technically being a Gator has uniquely equipped me for life because I've learned to deal with disappointment. We have the alleged professional football team of the Jaguars in Jacksonville, and of course we have our beloved Gators. So like I said, I've learned to deal with, well, next year. One of the things I've done, I do a bunch of stuff, is I have dealt with more fatal attacks on humans by dogs than pretty much anybody that I've ever heard of or we've ever been able to find out about. I started my work basically on the shoulders of those who came before me. Dr. Randy Lockwood is a friend, and he looked into them before I came along. The difference in what I do is, being an old retired police officer, rather than looking at reports later, what I started doing was actually going to scenes. And you know, if you're part of the police club, it tends to be easier to get in the door than if you're seen as some kind of a tree hugger from outside. And you know, that's not a good thing, but it's helped. And so I've been able to be on scene and actually not only brought my behavior training and experience in, but my crime scene experience and evidence experience in. It used to be that a police department would get on scene on a dog attack, and you got a body and you got a dog. So it's easy. You shoot the dog, you load up the meat wagon, and everybody goes home. But over the years, we have learned there's an awful lot more. Now tomorrow, we're actually going to talk about more of the gory stuff and interpreting bites. Today, I will warn you up front, there are a couple of rough slides. They're not just for dramatic effect. They actually have information that I want you as behavior consultants and trainers and experts to recognize some things. But first I want to introduce you to some friends of mine. These are dogs that over the years I have personally spent some time with and personally met. And the reason I like having these pictures is for us to understand sometimes different things. It's great to put a face to the person or the creature or whatever that we're dealing with. And so these are all faces of dogs that I have dealt with. And all of these dogs, well, they have several things in common. They have 4 legs. They're probably more trustworthy than people. They're the kinds of animals that we deal with every single day in our practices and out on the street. And yet they do have one thing in common that is unusual and makes them a rarity. Every one of those dogs killed a human being. Every one of those dogs killed a human. Every one of those dogs I've had hands on and been on scene. And so if you think you have a picture of what the face of aggressive behavior is, put an X through that and realize that bad behavior, dangerous behavior can come in any size, shape, or package that you can think of. Now, we talk about this as the International Association of Animal Behavior Consultants. And we talk about behavior, and this is a little bit rudimentary, but I want us to think about what behavior actually is, because people get excited and they get intimidated and whatever, and we start talking about behavior, and I'm going to put that so I can see my time. We start talking about behavior, and people don't really understand that Behavior is nothing magical or special. Behavior is simply what we're doing at any particular time. We are all behaving. Surprisingly, for a group like this, we're behaving nicely right now. But we're all behaving. Behavior is a basic tool on how we affect our environment and how we affect each other. If, for instance, we all decided we were too cold, we could find somebody and behave and ask them to turn up the temperature in here or turn it down. It's not magic. Behavior is something that meets a need. Now, with humans, we're a little bit more complicated, but animals do things because there's a reason to do them. There is a need that is typically being met. Any behavior that's presented sticks around or persists because it pays off. Some people get excited and saying, oh, I don't want my dog working for the cookies. We all work for the cookies. Every single one of us works for the cookies. Now, in our case, they come in little digital packages that show up on our phones, and then we transfer them to other little digital packages, and eventually we go to the grocery store and we grab our cookies. But everybody works for the cookies. Why? Because those are a reinforcement for what we do. And when we get the cookies, it proves the most important thing about that behavior. That behavior worked. It got us something. If you showed up at your job for 2 weeks, unless you're a government employee, and didn't get paid at all, you'd be really thinking about whether the third week you're going to show up or not, because that behavior no longer works. So behaviors persist or stick around because they work. Now, I want to show you a little bit of a clip here, and we're going to come back to this in a minute. But when it comes to behavior, aggression, the word aggression gets thrown around a lot. And scientifically, we can debate all kinds of stuff. I'm going to talk about that, but we need to understand what aggression is and how it fits into behaviors that work. The other thing I meant to say earlier is when there is actually a crime scene picture up on the screen, please don't photograph that, because I really don't want somebody to ever see their dearly departed child or relative or whatever on YouTube someplace. And that's just because of the way the things I do wind up with information that's not publicly available.
When I heard he was coming on, I was so happy. I just adore dogs, but I'm especially happy to meet you after your story yesterday. He's a Mastiff, right?
He's a Dogo Argentine.
Oh, okay.
So he's an Argentinian Mastiff.
Okay,
yes.
okay. You're gorgeous. You're gorgeous. Oh, I'm so glad you're okay. You too. You too. Thank goodness for you.
Yeah.
Gosh, have a great weekend.
Thank you.
Happy Valentine's Day.
Oh.
Oh my God.
Pretty fast, wasn't it? Was that an aggressive dog? We're going to talk about that and take this particular piece apart in a few minutes. But there are plenty of people who would have said, oh my God, that's an aggressive dog, it needs to be destroyed. The circumstance behind that is the lady that was bit is Kyle Dyer. She's a TV anchor in Denver, and she refused to cooperate with the dangerous dog investigation that others tried to start because she's a dog person and she understood what happened. But we're going to dissect that piece by piece here in just a minute. But aggression, how is it perceived? Lots of people would look at that and go, oh, that's a dogo, so it must be a problem. But B, they would look and say that was a mean or an evil or a dangerous dog that was trying to kill somebody. Bottom line is, that's not really what happened. Aggression is an adaptive behavior. It's a way an animal affects its environment and the animals around it. It's usually survival. In fact, it's pretty much always one way or another survival based. It can be a coping strategy for stress, and it can be a release of anxiety, but it still goes back to survival and adaptation. Organisms in general, whether they're humans or amoebas or dogs or the wonderful exotic stuff that Ken Ramirez deals with all the time, organisms only pursue behaviors that succeed, that help them survive, behaviors that are reinforced. And everybody in here knows the 4 quadrants and what reinforcement is. It's the payoff. Aggressive displays, with the exception of a few, and I've met a couple of them, a few mentally ill dogs, aggressive display makes sense to the dog. Now, there are a couple of loose cannons out there. I've met a couple. I think the number of canine loose cannons out in the world is probably way lower in percentage than the number of loose cannons with 2 legs. We're a lot crazier than they are. You may find that once in a while, and if you look into those, there's almost always something in the past, either genetic or more likely environmental and human caused, that feeds into that. But for the most part, we have to, as trainers and behavior consultants on the front edge, we have to remember that aggressive display and aggressive behavior made sense to that dog at that moment. And I want you to keep that in the front of your mind, because that's how we're going to try and address these issues. Aggression is species-specific adaptive behavior. Species-specific because the aggression you see in dogs is somewhat different from what you see in cats. I live in Florida, and I think they have them here in Houston. You know, the little green anolis lizards? Well, they'll puff out that little red sac under their throats. To a lizard, that's aggressive. To us, it's, "Aw, isn't that cute? The little lizard's got a little red thing here." That's aggression. So aggression is species-specific. You want to see aggression? All animals seem to provide it one way or another. The main purposes, and that's something I want to stress today, the main purposes for aggressive behavior are based in survival. Defense against a perceived threat, and perceived is very important. Doesn't matter whether it's real, it matters whether the animal perceives it. To establish or protect access to resources, or to establish or alter social standing. You want to see aggression that alters social standing? Turn on the Real Housewives of Atlanta. You're going to see social aggression. You're going to see jockeying for position. No, I am not a believer in whatever that your dog is trying to be dominant over you all of the time. I think the science is pretty clear on that. I'll talk about it just a little in a minute. Aggressive behavior is not a disorder that needs a cure. Perhaps its manifestations need to be altered because they're dangerous or worrisome to their caretakers, but aggression's not a disease. It's one behavior of many, and we can work with modifying behavior, especially if we understand the purpose of the behavior. Now, how do we know a dog's aggressive? Well, people tell us, but there's more to it, because there are typically cues and signals of various kinds that dogs use to communicate before going into a fully aggressive display. Very rarely does aggressive behavior kick off without warning. Yes, I know, we've all had clients that said, I was just sitting there and nothing happened, and suddenly he bit little Sally. Okay. That's because you either weren't paying attention or didn't know what you were looking at. Because dogs, even if it's quickly, tend to go through signaling and warning behaviors. Now, I swear I believe that my dogs think I'm their slow relative because we don't pick up on stuff as quickly as they do. And if you want to see signaling, take a couple of dogs and videotape, or record them now since nobody uses tape. Record them interacting, especially if there are a couple of dogs that don't know each other really well. And then go back later and slow down that video and watch for the signals and how fast and how many they're going back and forth. That it's amazing how many signals in the course of just a couple of seconds can happen. Dogs are fast. Anybody tells you they're almost bitten, they're wrong, because we're not fast enough. A dog can bite the first time in 0.2 of a second and can engage and release 3 times in 1 second. We have a reaction time of about 3/4 of a second, which means that those of us who've had those experiences, one of 2 things has happened. Either the dog pulled his punch, which is probably what happened, or consciously or unconsciously, we saw that signaling building up and were able to start our retreat and reaction before the dog fully committed. Anyway, aggressive behavior occurs as a sequence, and that signaling and warning behavior is part of that sequence. It also occurs on a spectrum. Unless you have an animal that has some serious problems, very rarely do they go from 0 to 90. There are a couple of very good illustrations of the progression, even though it's fast. I'm sure most of you have probably seen the spectrum that Tura Rugas has in her book on Talking Terms with Dogs. A friend of mine, Dr. Kendall Shepard over in the UK, has produced what she calls the ladder of aggression. There are many other authors who have a similar progressive spectrum. All aggression happens, like all behavior, on a spectrum. It's up to us to recognize the warning signals and to recognize where we are on the spectrum, and to recognize where in that spectrum we have the opportunity to intervene and redirect and retrain that behavior. We need to remember, though, that aggression as a behavior is not a mental state. It is a sequence of behaviors, a sequence of things that happen. So instead of going down the normal owner path of, oh, my dog was jealous, or he was having a bad day. Yes, there's a huge, very rich emotional life within dogs, just like there are with us. But what we can do is, instead of trying to impute emotional value to a particular state to a dog, instead, let's pull out the behavior analysis list and watch and observe and learn from the actions, not how we think the dog is feeling. Now, some of the warnings we get, we're all pretty familiar, but I want to brush over them really quickly, are things like posture. We can see in the picture up in the left that those are both dogs that are displaying manifestations of fearful behavior. The dog in the front is lowered body, is looking away, is trying not to engage. The dog in the back has withdrawn all the way to the back of the kennel. That's different from the dog on the right, who's got a hard stare. He's at the front. He's very much confident and present. Both of those cases are animals that are telling us that there is a chance, if we just go barging in, of aggressive display. that there's a danger of them having to escalate to a bite if we're not picking up the signals they're sending. We've got audible indicators, growl. And how many of you have ever been called and said, my dog keeps growling at me and I want to stop it? Yeah. No. That's the dog telling you. That's the dog communicating with you. That's the dog that's trying to tell you something is wrong here and we need to pay attention to it. Many people, including Ian Dunbar and Gene Donaldson and a lot of the others, caution, don't punish the growl. Instead, listen to it. That's one of the things that warns us that the dog is starting up that spectrum. Movement. Movement of a dog can tell us a lot, and this is something that I try to teach police officers on a regular basis. This is a trained protection dog. Please ignore that. It's not my dog. Ignore the e-collar on it. I didn't put it there. This is just filming. We won't even go down that road at this point. But this is a dog that is, he's been trained for this behavior, but this is a dog that is trying to close the distance. A dog that is closing the distance to you, depending on their body posture, is sending a different message from a dog that's trying to retreat. So movement can tell us a lot. The biggest indicator, of course, is finally a bite. Now, I'm going to apologize for the language in this. I was a little excited at the moment. The setup that you'll see here is this is actually me here in the gray. When I'm working with dogs that are truly problems, especially if it's evaluating something that has been involved in a fatality, I actually have what look like rain pants that are made of Kevlar. I wear gloves, and there are sleeves that they're not the training sleeves. They're actually Kevlar that'll go under a shirt. So I do have protective gear, which is what saved me in this case. But this case was my fault, absolutely and positively. But like I said, forgive the language a little bit.
You're a good boy. You're a good boy. Here. Ow! No! No! Ow! God damn it, no! Ow! Ow! Hey, give me God damn it! Juice, knock it off! No, don't do that. Grab him! Grab his legs! Grab his legs!
Grab his legs! Grab his legs!
Grab his back legs! Get him out! Ow! Son of a bitch! God damn it! God damn it! Get him around the neck! Thank you!
Hey! 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 Get me! Get me! Hey! Hey! Hold up! Hold up! One. Don't swing! Don't! Come on! Pull me out! Pull me out! Right there!
That was scary as crap. But it was my fault because I failed to be aware of the signals. The backstory on this, and it was after this that people, I swear, they told me that, oh, by the way, that dog's been declared dangerous in 2 states and sent 4 people to the hospital. Thanks, guys. It might have been nice to know that beforehand. The lead up to this was that there had been a fence fight between this dog and another dog, and I'd pulled the other dog off and got it and secured. And instead of waiting 20 or 30 minutes, because the dog was covered with blood, I let my heart override my head and went into the kennel with the dog. And it actually, at this point, had gone over the dog and ensured that all the blood was from ear tips and lips, just like normal fence fighting. Nothing was actually broken or damaged. But instead of backing out, I let my guard down and turned my back on him. And the first hit was to the back of my right calf, and then when I spun around, he grabbed me by the knee, and then he grabbed me up basically just over the femoral artery. Good news was that because of the magic of Kevlar, I was bruised for about 3 weeks, but I took absolutely no puncture wounds. So I got, between luck and equipment, I wound up not being seriously hurt. But that's where I failed to recognize the warnings and the lead-ups to what wound up being an extremely dangerous, aggressive incident. And as you can see, as I pulled loose, the gentleman who had grabbed the dog from behind, like you're supposed to, and slung him out of the way, the dog came back and grabbed him by the boot. And that was his normal caretaker. So this was a dog that was aroused and cranked to the point where all higher functioning in the brain was missing. Instead, this dog was in full attack/defense, whatever mode. And again, this was my fault. But this is what happens if we don't pay attention to those signals. Now let's go back to this situation, and thinking about signals, I'm going to stop it a couple of times. We're going to look at the signaling that was there.
I'm especially happy to meet you after your story yesterday. He's a mastiff, right?
Okay. Here we have the dog. The dog's actually doing pretty okay. You know, the owner's kind of stressed out, and if you watch, he's rapidly petting him, which is probably not helping anything. But right now, his mouth is soft, his eyes are pretty soft, and there's space between he and the TV anchor here. To set this up just a little bit, the day before, this is in Denver, and the day before, this dog had been out on the ice and fallen through and was rescued from the freezing water by the fire department. And since it was a great human interest story, the very next morning at 7:30 in the morning, they had him in the TV studio where he'd never been, surrounded by lights and big cameras and all of the chaos. Those of you who've ever been in a TV studio know what I'm talking about. And this dog had no clue as to what was going on. But here we've got indications that things are going
He's a Dogo
okay.
Argentine.
Oh, okay.
I said we're a little bit,
Argentinian Mastiff.
maybe a little bit tense there. Mouth now a little bit tense. We can watch the progression of the signals that warn us that something may happen. So he's going back and forth a little bit on, but right there, we saw a couple of licks and a look away. It's our responsibility to recognize those things because the dog is talking very, very clearly. The dog is trying to say, I'm not cool with what's going on here.
Gosh, have a great weekend.
And there we've got fairly loose, but the lady decides to come in for a kiss. And boom, lips tighten, eyes harden, teeth are exposed, and then we have contact. It was very quick, but all of those were signals that we would hopefully recognize and that we should be able to try to inform our clients to be looking for, to try to keep them safe when we do have an animal that has issues. Now, is that a dangerous animal? Probably not. That was an animal under a lot of stress in an unusual situation where the humans weren't paying attention. Had Kyle used her knowledge of dogs and simply kept back a couple of feet and not tried to go for the good TV by getting a kiss from the dog, this would have probably never happened. But that is one of the things we have to recognize when we're dealing with alleged aggression is what was the purpose of the bite and what led up to it. What was the purpose of this bite? Space. It wasn't to rip her face off. If he'd wanted to, she wound up with a torn lip and a couple of small punctures in her face. Because she's a TV person, she had reconstructive surgery. But the purpose of this bite was to get space. He tried using the tools at his disposal, the body posture, the withdrawing, the turn away, the tightening of the lips, the exposure of the teeth. He tried to use all the stuff that the universe gave him to say, get out of my face, and it didn't work, so he simply raised his voice. Fortunately, like I said, Kyle did not, in fact, refuse to cooperate with because Animal Services wanted to declare him dangerous because, oh my God, he's in Denver and kind of looks like a pit bull, so this is obviously an animal we have to kill. Refused to cooperate, and last I heard, he went on and lived a normal life. So this is why it's important for us to, as experts and as consultants, to be able to dissect incidents and understand the difference between the perception of aggression and that aggression is simply a behavior that helps an animal affect its environment. Now, in bites, we see different kinds of wounds, and there's a couple of gross pictures here. And we're going to get into this a whole lot tomorrow on evaluating the actual severity of wounds on an objective level and then using that to make plans. But we usually wind up with a couple of different types of wounds. This is very similar to what happened to Kyle. This is a simple engage and release. This is interspecies communication at its finest. This is get out my face, back off. There's a little bit of torn tissue here. When we look at bites, and again, I'm going to talk more about it tomorrow, that's withdrawal as the person and the dog pulled away. But this is a very simple, and this is actually probably 90 to 95% of the bite cases you'll see. It's an engage and release because the dog's purpose is to get somebody or something away from them. We get a little bit more serious here. Engage and hold. This is where a dog has grabbed on and pulled or grabbed on and shaken. The picture on the left is actually real good, and I'm going to come back to it tomorrow because it gives us a very clear picture of that dog's dentition and bite mark evidence. Although it's very unlikely you're going to be using it to prosecute anybody, you do have the ability as a behavior expert and as somebody who is familiar with dog behavior to work on occasion with law enforcement to help them figure out what happened and to help them figure out if somebody or who might be responsible for a situation. The one on the right, this was a child that was grabbed and dragged quite a substantial distance. That's a much more serious wound and a more serious bite. Then we go up to the actual shake and tear, where these animals not only grabbed on, but were shaking and tearing huge amounts of tissue. This is not a low-level bite. This is a high-level bite that shows very dangerous behavior. And then finally, we have multiple full engagement bites where the dogs are biting hard, they're shaking and tearing. This is a serious case of aggression that has gone beyond warning and beyond communication and is actually going into another kind of aggression and another purpose, that being predatory behavior. So, what do we do with aggression and how do we figure out what's going on? Well, this is a list of the types of aggression, and I'm sure we've all seen it in various and sundry books. You've got owner-directed dominance aggression, fear aggression, territorial, dog-on-dog to dominance, dog-on-dog to this, predatory this, This is a whole bunch of stuff, but as a retired police officer and having run a couple of animal control agencies, this stuff's interesting, but I'm a pragmatist. I'm less worried about dissecting stuff into little types than I am about finding out really what's going on and what works. Yesterday it was interesting to listen to Dr. Protopova about the motivations and the various breakdowns, and in an academic setting that needs to be done and is very important. For us on the street, if you will, telling somebody that they've got redirected food aggression, play, anti-sibling, whatever, it's too much information and doesn't help them understand what their problem is or how we're going to help them fix the situation. To me, typing, and it's a great academic exercise, but it's not particularly diagnostic as far as functional. Whether it's one type or another, or we've got authors arguing over the label of specific behaviors, really doesn't tell me as much as it should, and it doesn't tell our clients anything. It also doesn't provide us a plan forward. It doesn't give us a route to try and solve the problem. And the problem is that at the time we're called in, for some reason, the relationship between the human and the dog has failed. So we need to look for fixes. It doesn't matter, for instance, if your plumber goes in and says, well, your line is leaking because it's a PVC subtype A2 that cracks and you need PVC subtype 4. No, all you want is for your sink to stop leaking. That's how we have to look at our clients in a lot of cases, is all they want is to understand enough to keep their sink from leaking. So we don't want to fuss too much over labels. Instead, I prefer to apply purpose, looking at what behaviorally the animal was trying to accomplish, why the dog chose that particular behavior in that environment at that time with that person, because that helps me plan how I'm going to address the problem and look for remediation, look for fixing the cause, and restoring that relationship so that we have the animal that stays safely in the home and the people that stay safely with the animal. General purposes, what's the purpose of aggressive displays? Well, we can lump them into a couple of very broad and very easy to understand categories. They use aggressive displays to guard resources. The dog that sits there and growls and warns somebody from approaching the food bowl is guarding a resource. There are ways we can look, understanding that that's the purpose of the behavior, at changing that behavior. Communication. The bite you saw on TV there was communication at its finest. The dog sent a message that wasn't listened to. He finally sent a message that was listened to, and the TV anchor backed off and gave him the space. Doesn't matter whether the dog was properly socialized or not, quite frankly. It doesn't matter whether it was from the poor side of the tracks and didn't go to the best schools or any of those other things, or what type it fell into. That was a dog that was trying, its purpose was to communicate. We have predation, and I'm going to talk about that in a little more detail. But closely allied to each other is space, which is what that dog was trying to get, and defense or fear response. If we can understand these basic categories, then that helps us give a roadmap to where we're going. Being from Florida, obviously, I would reasonably be expected to be a Jimmy Buffett fan. And Jimmy said a long time ago that the best navigators are those who are not really sure where they are and they're not really positive where they're going, but they're getting there quite well. For us, that doesn't work as well, perhaps, as it does out sailing. We need to know where we're starting from and have an idea of where we're going, and then be able to with flexibility, and sometimes it takes a lot of flexibility, be able to plot a map towards where we're going. So if we understand purpose, of aggressive behavior, then we can help draw that map. Now, the first and most underlying cause or purpose for pretty much all behavior is survival. Every creature wants to survive. Not necessarily because they're attached to this life, but because we are all carriers for zygotes that are going to produce other carriers down the road and produce more zygotes, so our species continues as long as possible. That's why it's sad, but that's why we're here, is to produce more zygotes down the road. We're just intermediate hosts for production. So are dogs. So survival is one of the most important factors that really underlies behavior. Defense and fear. Also a little bit of a science fiction geek, so anybody who's ever read Dune would recognize the phrase there. But this is a great picture that I recently found, and it shows defense and fear posture very, very clearly. And this is something that one of the other things I do is I teach and train police officers across the country how to safely deal with dogs without shooting them every time. And being a retired police officer, it helps me get in the door. The curriculum I've written is now being reviewed by the Department of Justice. Hopefully the 8-hour training will be mandatory across the U.S. for all police departments and all officers, teaching them how to recognize behavior and how to use less than non-lethal tools and strategies to keep them and the pets and the public safe. But this is perfect. We've got a tail that's down. We've got body posture where the body weight is back. The dog's ears are engaged and looking at its target, but are kind of in the process of coming back. The dog is showing teeth and is obviously barking, but this is a dog that we can recognize is probably worried and being defensive because they're perceiving some sort of threat. We talked about movement. This is a dog who's ready to hit the bricks if you just give him a way out. And so defense and fear is a huge driving purpose between a lot of what people want to classify as aggressive behavior. But that's not a dog that's trying to hurt you. That's a dog that's trying to survive and trying to address that fear. As part of that, like we saw with the other, space is a huge reason for an aggressive display. Which way out of here? There are three things, and we're aware of this, but there are three things that an animal that's under threat can do. The first is it can freeze, like the bunny rabbit in the middle of the road. The car's coming and it goes, "You can't see me," and then winds up getting run over, which is different from the squirrel who's going, "Nanny, nanny, boo-boo, hit the brakes, I'm out of here," and tries to run you off the road. There's a reason for the phrase deer in the headlights, because those animals, their response to a threat is to freeze and try to blend in. And the deer don't realize that in the middle of I-95 at dusk, they can't blend in. They're going to get hit. However, the primary responses to a threat are to flee or to fight. The preferred response is obviously to flee, because if you run away today, you survive to breed tomorrow. Fighting is typically a last choice, and so an animal will try to give an aggressive or enhanced size or whatever display of behavior, keeping their eyes out for the exit, because most of the time, given the opportunity, pretty much any animal will choose to disengage if they can. And it goes back to survival. If every time you had two animals that ran across each other and disagreed, or you had an animal that came in contact with another animal that was bigger and badder and had less to lose than it did, then those species would die out pretty quick. So looking at space as a purpose for an aggressive display helps us think ahead and put together a plan on how we're going to help that animal understand whether it needs space or not, whether it needs to defend itself or not, and how to react in a way that fits in with our lives better. Resources. An animal that is deprived of resources is going to do what it has to do to eat. Does that mean it's aggressive? No, not necessarily. The dog that you see in that picture there is from New York City. That dog ate a 6-day-old infant. But was it a bad dog? Probably not, because the owner of the dog was a drug addict. She had had the baby and admitted to investigators that she had not fed the dog in at least 7, possibly 10 days. You can see from the dog that it's probably not the first time, because to get to that level, do we have any vets in here? Yeah. To get to that level takes more than 5 or 6 days, doesn't it? We're talking weeks of chronic malnutrition. So that when this person left with her 6-day-old infant on the floor and went out to score drugs, the dog pursued the only survival strategy that it had been given, and that was to use the protein source that was available. It's easy, and unfortunately when dogs kill human beings, regardless of the cause, they're typically destroyed. But I kind of felt for that dog, because the dog was as much of a victim as the child was. The dog was simply trying to survive. So that survival instinct gave us the purpose for the aggressive actions, for the, in this case, predatory actions. But lack of resources can produce an aggressive response. So if we're trying to work with an animal that's a resource guarder, by looking at that purpose, we can form a plan so that we can fulfill potentially the need of the animal, and then once the need is fulfilled, we can train an alternative response. We're going to talk more about that in just a minute. You will have health-related behaviors. Dogs, and we all know it, especially the doc knows that you can get an aggressive response from a dog that's a pain response. Makes sense. I know, I'm sure you've got it, you've had it, I've gotten them where people have called and they've said, my dog bit my child for no reason. Okay, fine. And you dissect the incident and you try and find out, and we're going to talk about it, what was going on beforehand. And in that particular case, the most recent one, I had a dog with a flaming ear infection. And the child reached over and grabbed the dog by the ear, and the dog turned and bit the child in the face. We now know the purpose of why the dog acted the way he did. A quote that I ran across in the literature was, and it was the same kind of case. A dog with otitis bites. Context will be considered. Painful condition, defensive aggression. Okay, why do we need to type that? When interpreting this aggressive event, and this dog will likely not be labeled as high risk, dangerous dog, aggression in the context of pain can be appropriate. This dog is protecting himself from further pain and is communicating that he doesn't want physical contact. Yeah, duh. Give me a break, guys. I don't need all that. Because my response is going to be, take your dog to the vet. The dog is hurting. I don't need a whole bunch of types and descriptions and technical terminology to tell my client, take the dog to the vet. The dog is in pain. I'm sorry your child got bit, but this is the way we fix it, because the purpose was to get that nasty little child off of the ear that hurt. And understand, I have children. Mine are 31 and 26, and the oldest one's about to give us our first grandbaby, but children are nasty little creatures. I'm sorry. As a former child, it was hell. But anyway, health-related behaviors. We have to be sensitive to those and be looking for them, even though we're not vets, because health may have a profound effect on, in fact, it does have a profound effect on behavior, and may help us find the purpose for the incident we're being called to. If you've got a dog that's had a chronic ear infection, and part of the problem is that whenever you reach to pet it on the head, it turns and is hand shy, that medical condition has given a purpose to the avoidance behavior, and if the owner doesn't recognize that, may wind up at a very good risk of being bitten. And if you do recognize it, then not only can you send the dog to the vet, but you can go ahead and begin desensitizing that reaction, because you understand why the dog has been doing this. One of the things we do find sometimes that causes aggressive displays is conflict resolution. No, as I said before, I don't believe your dog is sitting there planning to overthrow you if you show weakness and take the fridge. And just to put that in context a little bit, if we go back to the behavioral experts of the time that came up with a lot of this dominance hierarchy stuff, what we have is a bunch of old white guys who were running the show, and when they went out into the world to look at animal interactions, since they came from a society that had a bunch of old white guys in charge and telling everybody else what to do, that's exactly what they found in the animal world. We now know from some of the more current wolf research on wolves actually in the wild rather than those in captive situations that social groups are a lot more fluid and a lot more democratic than we believed in the past. But there is still conflict resolution, and aggressive displays can be part of that conflict resolution. Again, watch the Real Housewives of whatever, and you will see aggression used to try and resolve conflicts. Remember and keep in the back of your mind that for survival reasons, most conflict resolution, including most dogfights, are ritualized combat. I'm sure we've all seen it. I know I have, that there's a horrible, loud, nasty sounding conflict between two dogs, and fur flies and spits all over the place, and you separate them, and there's really, other than maybe a couple of dings on the ears, there's very little damage in healthy, behaviorally sound animals, because those conflicts, if they escalated to one animal being killed and one animal being seriously injured, then the species probably wouldn't survive long. Dogfights are an artificially constructed, artificially reinforced, artificially selected for sets of behavior that are completely different. And just because a dog is a fighting dog doesn't mean it's necessarily a danger, and doesn't mean it can't be necessarily fixed. I'm going to discuss a case tomorrow. I've been on a bunch of dog fighting cases, and to kind of give you a slight spoiler, from one of the cases we have dogs that we were able to rehabilitate and are now honestly working as police dogs, as detector dogs out in the world, rather than being killed as fighting dogs. But conflict resolution may be a purpose in at least dog-dog interactions. We also have the problems of people who either think it's cute or funny or desirable to teach their dogs and reinforce aggressive displays, or that through their own conduct have reinforced aggressive behavior, whether it was consciously or unconsciously. And my probably the most common example of that is you get called, and I don't mean to insult anybody because I'm getting up there too, but it's typically the little old lady who's got the little fuzzy marf, and they're having problems, and you go up and she's got the little fuzzy dog in her, and the dog is everybody, and the owner is always, oh, it's okay, she won't bite, she's fine. No, your dog is not fine, and your dog is going to bite the crap out of me. I would rather go ahead and be dealing with a 90-pound Presa Canario, Dogo Argentino, Pit Bull Rottweiler mix, because me and that dog are going to get along fine. But that little sucker has been taught that whenever somebody comes up, it gets reassurance, and it gets pets, and it gets reinforcement for the behavior. And sure enough, if somebody comes in range, it's going to bite the holy living daylights out of them. That's human caused. Now, that's been reinforced, so it's less involved with survival perhaps and more involved, but the purpose of that dog's behavior goes back to it perceived somewhere something as a threat and was reinforced for the behavior. So that helps us make a plan on how we may possibly, if the owner is cooperative, be able to work around that. It's the fault of the caretakers, not necessarily the animal. Now, the big one that people get real excited about is predatory behavior. And I will tell you that true predation on human-sized targets by domestic dogs is extremely, extremely rare. In fact, human predation by healthy wolves in the wild is actually rare, not just because the people and the wolves don't come together that often, but because when you're, and even when you're an apex predator like a wolf in the environment, if something isn't weak and isn't injured and isn't the size of lunch, you really don't want to have a whole lot to do with it unless you are in a situation where you really have to provide food. You know, wolves hunt in small, usually family-oriented groups, and they can take down big animals. But energy-wise and safety-wise, a wolf would much rather go and find a field of stupid bunny rabbits that he can expend a very little bit of energy and have a fine dinner than take the chance of getting hurt and having to get all of his buddies to take down an elk. So predation with domestic dogs, as far as going through the full process, is actually pretty rare, at least with human-sized targets. Predation is a behavior that's focused at its end on the capture and consumption of a prey animal. Now, it may not go all the way through all the time. And predation may be confused and mistaken for other behaviors. We have the whole difference between the desire of dogs naturally to chase and those that are actually being predatory. And it blurs in the middle. But when we are looking at behavior and we're looking at the purposes of behavior, we need to recognize what predation is and whether this is an animal that's going through and actually trying to complete the full sequence, or this is an animal that is simply chasing something. The odds are that the dog that chases the child on the bicycle down the road, the odds are that that is not true predatory behavior. But we do see behaviors that come out of that. This is what's called the canine predatory motor sequence, and this is behavior that we see pretty much in all canids, whether it's dogs, coyotes, wolves, hyenas, and so forth. It starts with orienting. The animal looks around and sees something that it wants or needs to and recognizes as a potential prey creature. Then you get the eye, and those of you with border collies know what the eye is. That's that, I've got target lock on, beep, 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 my missiles are ready. Then typically there's a stalk. And again, border collies, you'll see that as they're coming up towards their herding targets. Then goes the chase. Ba-boom, we're off. If we continue on the predatory sequence, then there's typically a grab bite that's usually intended, the purpose of it is to disable a larger animal or to grab a small animal and then shake and hopefully break its neck and complete the process there. Then we go into kill bite. In large animals, in an actual predatory situation, typically the dogs or the canids will take out the legs first, and then they will go for the abdomen, because the abdomen, if they do massive damage to it first, causes a lot of bleeding. It also contains most of the high caloric value internal organs. And if you're a predator where there's other predators and scavengers around, you want to get the good stuff as quick as you can and leave the chicken wings for somebody else. So the other thing is abdomens, although there's feet involved, abdomens usually don't have teeth and pointy things on the end of them. So you're actually a little bit safer for going through that. But this, canids will typically, they'll do the kill bite, they'll dissect, which is the pulling apart and getting at those good organs, and then they will consume. And along in there somewhere, it's very, depending on the species and the circumstance, they will carry parts of the kill back to their den, or at least off to the side to a safer place. If you wind up looking at an animal-to-animal kill and there's a question whether it's a domestic dog or a coyote, keep in the back of your minds, coyotes tend to grab chunks and move away from the primary kill site more commonly than domestic dogs do. There's a lot of other things you have to look at, and sometimes it's hard to tell. But I've learned that that's actually a behavioral pattern that's more common with coyotes than it is with domesticated dogs. But this is the predatory sequence. Now, we do see this in dogs, and over the millennia that we've been in contact with dogs, we have adapted some of these things to other purposes. The orient, the eye, the stalk, border collies, the chase. The chase and the grab bite, that's your Labrador that's chasing the tennis ball or retrieving the duck for the hunter. Kill bites, dissect, various animals interrupt this along the way. But it is still a sequence that is out there and can happen in cases where we're looking at serious attacks and serious interactions with humans. A predatory attack, if someone is describing it to you, is usually follows mostly this process or these cues. A predatory attack is typically silent. So a dog that's barking and chasing somebody down the road is probably more involved in simply the chase drive or the chase desire, the chase purpose, than it is to actually doing damage. They acquire a specific target. A lot of times they will perform the stalk and wait in hiding. I worked a fatality where the child was walking down the road, and unbeknownst to him, one of the dogs literally was hiding in a bush. And when the child walked by, the dog sprang out because he saw him coming and started the chase. And as the child fled, the other dogs in the group on that property took off after the child, took the child down, dragged him back onto their property, and consumed him. So stalking and waiting and hiding is much more common in an actual predatory event than it is in a dog that's just simply chasing and barking. They'll lunge and chase the target. They will, again, as we said, administer a disabling blow and then kill the creature on sight, and very often drag it to its den and then consume it either immediately or pull it apart and consume it a bit later. Now, keeping that sequence in mind, I want you to watch a video here, and this is in a food court in South Africa. You're going to see there's, and I always have to orient every time I look at this, there's a gentleman sitting here, and he's got a dog with him that you're going to see pop out here. There's a little girl in a yellow, there she is, in a yellow shirt that is going to walk away and then come back through here. And I want you to watch this behavior. This is a domestic pet dog, but the dog exhibits the exact behaviors we're talking about. Little girl's here, and there's the dog. Watch what he does. She's over here, and where is he looking? He's tracking. He has the eye, he has the position of hiding, the position of ambush. He's still focused on it, and his owner is absolutely clueless here. He's got target acquisition, and he's watching. When his prey re-enters, boom. He takes her down, disabling, drags her under the table. Fortunately, all the people jump in and they're able to get the dog off. That's predatory behavior. That's a dangerous animal. And again, I find this to be such a great illustration that when you are looking into bite cases and dealing with cases, this is the kind of behavior that is really, really a problem. Again, we've acquired our target moves away, the dog is patient, but he never goes back under the table, he never retreats. Instead, he keeps that semi-concealed position behind this chair here, or whatever it is, and waits for his prey to show back up. Fortunately, this girl didn't take any serious injuries, but it could have been. Here comes the prey, boom, engage, take down, and withdraw back into a position of safety. So yes, domestic dogs can show that predatory behavior. This was another case, and they're very rare, but this was another case of predation. This was the young man who was walking along a road. Dogs popped out. It was right at dusk. He was, after talking with his mother, he was actually afraid of dogs. The first small dog, and it was actually an interesting case because they held the scene till I could get there. And on the roadway in front of this property, you could see where he had walking footprints and then dog footprints that came out, and suddenly then he goes to running footprints. The dogs chased him in the road, took him down, disabled him, dragged him about 65 or 70 feet up into a yard, and then as you can see, there was many, many bites. They ripped the soft tissue off the body. They actually consumed the tissue. There was human tissue recovered from the necropsies of all of the dogs. It was multiple engagement from multiple directions, and this was the product of that full canine predatory motor sequence from A to Z. These dogs I didn't have a chance to evaluate because the night that it happened, one of the dogs, somebody broke into the animal shelter and stole one of the dogs back. So the next morning while I was on the way up there, the police department called me and I said, put them down now. I don't want them stolen. I don't want them getting back out there. But we did recover a substantial amount of human tissue from within the dog's stomachs. So that is predatory behavior.
Did they ever get the dog back when it was stolen?
No, we didn't get the dog back. Yes, we convicted the owner and sent him to prison for 5 years. The sad part of that was the owner was actually present in the trailer at the time of the attack. He claimed he was on the road driving a truck in Oklahoma, but this was in South Carolina, and his cell phone at right about the time of the attack hit a tower a quarter mile away and not in Tulsa. So yeah, we were able to send him to prison, but it still wound up being a horrible case for the child. But no, we did never get that dog back, and that was actually the youngest dog of the bunch. And for those of you, just to show how screwed up people are, I worked a case up in West Virginia where the suspect, the primary dog that actually did the killing, had 11 puppies on the ground in the home when the attack happened. And we could take the adult dog that did the killing, but we could not legally seize the 11 puppies. And these were allegedly staffy American Staffordshire Terriers. Yeah, right. But those puppies that would have been normally giveaway puppies sold for $1,500 a piece to the rednecks in western West Virginia and eastern Ohio because their daddy had killed somebody. So there's some sick people out there, and unfortunately I run across them. So anyway, thinking about the purposes and thinking about things like predation, where does that get us? Well, it helps us understand the reason that aggressive displays and aggressive behavior exists. It exists for survival reasons. We can look beyond the label of aggressive, and we can look at the purpose behind the aggressive behavior. And we can look at it objectively in a manner of assessing and classifying the behavior and remove the human baggage of human morals and values. By understanding purpose, we can put away the idea that something is jealous or mean or inherently vicious or any of those value systems we tend to put on it, but instead it gives us tools where we can start to map out a plan of treatment, a plan of management, a plan of safety for the animal and the people involved. We can treat, manage, or address the root causes by looking for the purpose of the behavior that's been shown and understanding it. That helps us also decide how to safely handle animals, dogs, especially by understanding the purposes of those behaviors. I want to throw something out here now that I doubt I'm ever going to hear from somebody in this room, but in the world out there, you have all heard the people who go, yeah, I'm great with aggressive dogs. Look at all the scars up and down my arms. Yeah, hey, those aren't medals, fool. I've been bitten plenty of times. Except for one, it's always been my fault, and that was because a volunteer at Katrina did something they were told not to, and I took the bite instead of them. But I've been bitten. Those are not marks of honor. Those are not marks of successes. Those are marks of you screwed up, and that doesn't impress me. We've all seen sometimes in the animal control world, people will say, oh, I'm really good with aggressive dogs. That means they're good with a catch pole. And if they're really that good with the catch pole, maybe they don't understand the behavior that much, because the catch pole is likely to be more of a problem than the original issue. I had the pleasure a few years ago of going over to the UK twice, and one of the two I worked with what's called the status dog unit of the Metropolitan London Police. And those guys were amazing. Number one, the London police, now with terrorism there's more of it, but typically are not armed. So simply shooting a dog during a raid is usually not an option. And these guys were funny. It was testosterone in reverse. Because these guys, their job was to go with the metropolitan officers on raids when there were dogs, whether it was for prohibited dogs, which most of them agreed was a stupid rule, or criminals with dogs and everything else. And sitting in the office with them, they'd come in and go, oh yes, yesterday I had an Alsatian that was 90 pounds, and I was able to go in with only a sleeve on one arm and was able to get him on the catch pole with no problem. And the other guy goes, oh, you wimp, I had a Rottweiler yesterday that was 110 pounds, and I walked in with a lead and only had to put my gloves on. And the third one would come up and go, oh, you're both weenies. I had a 200-pound dog de Bordeaux that had bitten 3 people, and I went in with a shoestring and a cookie and led them out. And I thought to myself, my God, this is the coolest bunch of attitudes I have ever run into in the animal world, because these guys are going out of their way and competing to deal with the biggest and baddest dogs with the least possible intervention. Now, that said, dealing with aggression is not a competition. There are plenty of people who do plenty of work on a day-to-day basis. For instance, even though he's got a history, Dr. Dunbar, Ian Dunbar, works with puppies and socialization and has had massive positive effect in puppy socialization across the world. Ian developed, and I'm going to talk about it tomorrow, the bite assessment scale, and used to deal with bites a lot, but he went a different way. So dealing with problem dogs is not a competition to try to handle the biggest and baddest and nastiest dogs. I've dealt with, like I said, better than 50 dogs that have killed human beings. I know that each and every one of those dogs was bigger and badder than I am, and had to look for different solutions rather than trying to either impress anybody or to force my will on that dog, because the dog had already shown that it was fully capable of taking out a person. Instead, there's a whole strategy, and we don't have time to get into today, but safe handling, if we understand the purpose of aggressive behavior, then we can understand how to modify our behavior to be able to minimize the danger to us and to the dog. Because remember, and that's one of the reasons I wear the protective gear, not only to keep myself from going home with holes I didn't leave with and having my wife yell at me, but remember that when we're dealing with a dog, your mistake may cost the dog its life. That dog may already have strikes against it. So if you don't understand and are not comfortable with, or are trying to go in over your head because you think this is a competition, then you may be risking not only your own safety, but the actual life of that animal. So by using our knowledge, we can safely handle animals when we can. And there have been a couple of them I've said, I'm not taking that out of the kennel. I can see all I need to from here. Sorry, I don't need to get hurt on purpose. We can plan for safe management, and we can inform our clients how to manage their animals to minimize the risk to their animals, to other animals, and to themselves. And we can put together that treatment plan. When we're looking at the treatment plan, in my way of going after it, I'm focusing on fulfilling needs, understanding what need the dog is trying to fulfill or problem it's trying to address when it's showing aggressive behavior. When I find the triggers, And tomorrow we're going to talk about evaluations a little bit. I'm also really looking forward to today to listening to Dr. DiArpino about evaluations. But looking for triggers and then working to desensitize them, and then planning for replacement behavior. Replacement behavior, the way I look at it is that a behavior that you use to replace an aggressive behavior has to provide relief to the dog. If it's a dog that is fearful, if it's a dog that is anxious, we need to provide a release for that. We need to provide relief for it or from the stimulus, whether it's a perceived threat or something else that's going on. We need to make sure that their resources are being properly provided, that their welfare is proper, and that they're not operating from a deficit, and that we can reinforce the replacement behavior is a reinforceable behavior that we can make pay off and we can make solve the dog's problem. So to review real quick, behavior is simply what we do. Aggression is nothing more or less than one kind of behavior. Aggression is one way that the dog can change its relationship with other animals, with humans, and with its environments. Aggression has a purpose, except, like I said, in those very rare cases of mental illness. But aggression has a purpose, and so if we find the purpose for the aggressive display or for the aggressive behavior, then we can start mapping out the way to address that, to look at the underlying needs that are not being met, to look at the reasons and driving forces that are placing that animal in a position where aggressive display or aggressive behavior makes sense and is somehow successful, and then to replace that aggressive behavior with something that meets the dog's needs, that meets our needs, and keeps all of us as safe as possible. If I can ever be of any help to you, please feel free to reach out. You can find me, I'm canineaggression@gmail.com. I have a blog that, yes, I know I haven't updated it in a long while, but it's out there. So if you just simply Google Jim Crosby Aggression Blog, it comes up. And I promise I will try to get that updated. If you are interested, and I didn't put a picture, I'll have a picture tomorrow in that presentation. There is a book out. It was published by the University of Lincoln in England. It's called Dog Bites, a Multidisciplinary Approach. It was edited by Kerry Westgarth and Daniel Mills. Kerry is with University of Liverpool. Daniel is up at Lincoln. I've got 2 chapters in that book. It's currently, unfortunately I don't make any money off of it, it's currently on Amazon, and it has, although it's kind of from a Eurocentric point of view, it has a lot of information on dog bites, dog bite investigations, perceptions of witnesses, and perceptions of victims, and it's out there, yes. The title of the book is, and I've got a picture of it if you come tomorrow, it's called Dog Bites, a Multidisciplinary Approach. And it's on Amazon. It's a little expensive, and I said I wish I made something off of it. But it's, without tooting my own horn too much, it's really probably the most comprehensive text-level guide to dog bites and aggression as far as biting goes that's out there. And so thank you for having me.